Have you ever thought about the dyes used to color your clothing? If not, you should have. We'll tell you why. This is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we are joined by Rebecca Burgess, who is an expert in this area. She's the executive director of Fibershed, a word which she coined. And this is a local resource for creating textiles for dyes for textiles and clothing. And she's been doing this for a long time, for well over a decade, and she's got some really interesting insights to share with us today. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you for having me here. It's great. I appreciate your time.
So this is an area where many people aren't too familiar with. They don't really pay much attention to. So why don't you first provide us with an understanding of your background and how you came to this area and why you've been doing this for the last 15 years?
I started this work actually when I was asked to teach young children how to use I was taught to train young children in how to use dyes. I'll just put it that way. When I was in college, it was a textile arts summer program that I was in charge of direct instruction for 10 or so 9-year-olds. And it was a summer job, and it exposed me to the arts and crafts side of textile dyeing, which a lot of the ingredients for the craft dyes are the same ingredients. They're actually a better quality ingredient than what is used for industrial production. And so in the process of teaching children about color, especially the color that you would make, a summer camp tie-dye t-shirt with, I was 19 and I was helping them use these compounds to color t-shirts. And we had to wear all these gloves, and I had to wear a mask, and people had to wear aprons. We couldn't let the powder get in the air. We were so careful once we opened these jars of powder to not get it in our lungs or not get it on our skin, because that's
these were the commercial dyes that you were using.
Mm-hmm. For craft use, for anything from tie-dye to any kind of textile project. Mm-hmm. And so, the ingredients list wasn't very clear. The molecular breakdown of what was in the material wasn't clear, but the producers of the dyes were asking anyone who used them to be very careful with mm-hmm. inhalation and exposure, especially skin exposure, hence mm-hmm. the gloves and the masks. So it did kind of, a light bulb went off, like, why am I having children use a material that they have to wear masks and gloves? And while we're using the material, we're making the dye, we're, suited up. And then we take the t-shirt out of the bucket, we rinse it a little, and then we put the t-shirt on our bodies. Mm-hmm. So somehow it's okay to wear the stuff on your skin, but it's not okay to touch the powder. Mm-hmm. So right there was kind of a chasm between what seemed like solid logic in what we were willing to expose ourselves to and why we were doing what we were doing. So I started to, at that time, it was before we had Google, but I was looking into how, searching Ask Jeeves was the search engine at the time. And I was looking into...
It's over 20 years ago then. It's been around for 20 years.
Yeah, I'm 40, and so it was like 21 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was this question I had about making color from something mm-hmm. else. And Ask Jeeves responded with, oh, you can use onion skins and cabbage and beets. And I was like, okay. So I went to the organic food co-op at UC Davis. It's a very small town, and we had a little member-owned co-op, and I went and got all the onion skins from the bottom of the barrel and beets and cabbages, and I rode my bike along a green belt, and I harvested blackberries and dandelion leaves. I had learned that these things too make color. And so I just started bringing food-based products into our textile program. And the kids started cutting up vegetables and putting it in pots of water, heating it up, and making tie-dye t-shirts, but with cabbage color, onion, beets, blackberries, and dandelion. And then we could take that effluent, cool it down, and then pour it back out on the lawn. Like it was tea, essentially.
Or you could drink it.
Or you could drink it.
Yeah. Which highlights the non-toxicity.
Exactly. So I did, a woman at UC Davis did her master's thesis it was called Pandora's Box. And in my quest to find out what was in these dyes that I had been using prior to the beets, cabbage, and onion skins, dandelions, blackberries, I found out that through this woman, I think her name was Virginia Platt, this paper was circulating around campus, and I noticed she had a list of things that were in all dyes, industrial production to craft. There were these endocrine disruptors that they know are in all the industrial dyes, and all these dyes are made with fossil carbon-based substances. And she pointed to the fact that it took 400 pounds of coal tar to make 1 ounce of blue dye. And that was the first recipe for a synthetic dye. And it was actually an accident. This guy named William Perkins was looking for a cure for malaria and was using coal tar, and he had an explosion in his lab in like 1856. And all this purple goo landed on the walls of his lab. And then he realized that could actually be a textile dye, but it was coal tar based. So all of the dyes ever since then, the Industrial Revolution, dye processes are fossil carbon derived and heavy metal combined. So that in itself was how we started our industrial dye process. And of course, things have evolved. There are closed loop systems. There are processes that take the heavy metals out of the dyes. Those are called, I believe, acid dyes. But at the end of the day, all the dyes have endocrine disruptors, which are as you know, they scramble the cells' ability to communicate with each other, because they scramble the hormone, balance. And, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone are the messenger chemicals. And if those are scrambled, you can create a lot of subsequent health issues, from cancer to autoimmune diseases to learning disabilities. And some people say there's multiple generation impacts that can happen. So I don't know what you might call that intergenerational DNA damage that can occur, but it's very much a part of, the peer-reviewed science on endocrine disruption is very clear. And we don't know enough about how many parts per trillion, parts per billion, or parts per million of these endocrine disruptors are in the textiles when we're putting them on our skin, because it's just an unknown body of research that who's going to pay for that. And it's not the industry. So we have an unknown, but we know we have risks. And we have enough science to know there are risks. And so that's why I'm a proponent of using plant-based dyes,
Sure.
Which are dyes made from roots and leaves, things that you could eat, basically.
Yeah, and certainly safe in most cases, or far safer than the ones that you mentioned, the industrially based dyes, which can be toxic, and most of us don't tend to consider when we're purchasing clothes, and how that material was given its color. But would this be the same for the dyeing process for synthetic as opposed to non-synthetic clothing, nylon versus cotton?
Really good question. The synthetic dyes are used right now on all cellulosic, protein, and synthetic fibers. In fact, even an organic cotton t-shirt, if it's pink or green or blue, if it's not white, or colored grown cotton can be brown. You can produce cotton that isn't white. But I've seen organic cotton t-shirts where they'll say, it's dyed, it's synthetically dyed. We tried to use the cleanest dyes we can. But so you'll see people really attempting to do good things by dyeing organic cotton with the most ethical synthetic dyes they can. But at the same time, it seems a little antithetical to me to have an organic cotton t-shirt with this fossil carbon derived dye layered onto it, all the way through nylons and polyesters, which, yes, very much, those fiber systems are very consistently using azo dyes. Around 60 to 70% of the global use of dyes right now are azo, and azo are some of the more hazardous dyes. They're the most difficult to clean up. They have heavy metals. These are used in most of the industrial systems today, and it's very rare you see what we call a GOTS, a global organic trade standard on, there is GOTS standard dyes.
Yeah, and for those who know, that's the gold standard or platinum standard of organic. It's really the best certification you can get.
And it's very robust. I won't say anything, naysaying about that standard. It's the most robust thing I have seen out there. But they do allow synthetic material, but it's very well regulated.
And that is just for the raw material for the source. So they do they certify clothing as GOTS certified after it's been dyed with these synthetic dyes? Oh, they do. Okay, so it's possible to be GOTS certified and still have a synthetic dye.
As far as I have read in their most recent iteration.
Okay, so that probably is something that needs to be updated and revised, I would think. But that goes to some other questions which we'll discuss shortly. But before we talk about the commercial viability of that approach, I'm wondering if you could comment on your awareness of any research or studies that have looked at the transfer of these potentially toxic dyes from the clothing, the dyed clothing, to the skin and then into the body, because certainly the dyes themselves are toxic. There's no question. It's just non-controversial, but I guess the issue becomes, does this dye get transferred from the clothing, especially after it's been washed a number of times, to your body?
I think that question is something that I've been asking for over a decade, and the science that I have found is actually very dated. I found some research about children who supposedly died from, they used cloth diapers and they were stamped with an ink, and the ink penetrated, I guess maybe the kidney area of the infant. And this science was done in the 1920s in our dye. So I literally, after that, I couldn't find any modern science that showed skin absorption had any toxic effects on the wearer from a synthetic dye permeating a permeable layer of our body. The question is, how big are the molecules of the dye? Can they get into the skin? After we're washing the clothing, we're washing off what we would call the unbonded molecular components of the dye, where the stuff that is bonded to the clothing, does that pose a risk? Can it get into the skin if it's molecularly bonded? These are all still questions on the table. And I think that go ahead, sorry.
And no one's looking at it. Or virtually
I have
no one,
not
at least
seen
not to your awareness. And this is really one of your passions, and you're diligently searching to find these answers. And so far as you're aware, no one is examining this issue.
No, I mean, if a listener has come across the research, I would be very keen on having it forwarded to me. But I was doing this research for a book in the last 2 years, and I even had a team working with me. And I was calling reproductive health doctors at Mount Sinai and UCSF, who focus a lot, especially on the chemical composition and health that surrounds a pregnant woman. So, fertility questions. Why are we having fertility issues? Why are children being born with higher levels of learning challenges and autism and these things? So these women that I did some interviews with, they were saying, we know these chemicals do really not good things and do affect mothers who are pregnant, and the in utero fetus, we can see there's impacts with these chemical compounds. And we know that they're in dyes. But how are they getting into the body? So one study I thought was really interesting was one of the endocrine disruptors that causes a lot of problems is actually in Tylenol. You probably know about Tylenol has a very strong endocrine disruptor in it that reacts in the body the way a phthalate does.
Mhm.
And it's metabolite, I guess you would say, or it metabolizes into a phthalate, and it creates reduced anogenital distance, smaller penile size, less male play behavior. It creates a lot of problems in utero male babies. The exposure to this phthalate, but it actually comes through Tylenol. So there was a German study where all these women were taken off what they considered all of the exposure to this endocrine disruptor that, again, it shows up in Tylenol, and it shows up in other things. And they were thinking, okay, well, we'll try to reduce all the exposures we know of. And will these women's urine still be showing the metabolite? Will we still see that the endocrine disruptor is going through their system while we get rid of everything we can think of that would expose them to this? And again, I'm not articulating this study as well as I'd like to, because it's not my background to articulate peer-reviewed science all the time. But what was fascinating was that these women kept urinating out this endocrine disruptor. It was still coming out of their bodies even when they eliminated all the possible exposures. And so in the paper, they say, well, one of the exposures we haven't looked at is textiles and clothing and what women are wearing. This is an area for further research. So who's doing it? We would really like to know, because it's an important thing. And so I'll leave it with, I'm almost less concerned sometimes with skin absorption. I'm almost feeling now that the more research I do, it's actually the lint that comes off the textile. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about inhalation and dust in the home. All this dust and lint so much of it is the textile debris. So if this debris that comes off our clothing is on the floor and children are crawling on the floor or our pets are laying in it, how much of this lint with these compounds is actually something that we and our children and our pets are inhaling? That's of interest to me.
So with that understanding, it might be wise to wear a little mask when you're cleaning the lint trap from your dryer.
Perhaps, yeah.
So with that understanding and the toxicity of some of these dyes, would you consider it wise for having a large percentage of your clothing be white? Or are there some dangers with the white because of the bleaching or the processing with that?
I would say, well, my recommendation for textiles is that
I know that you use, let me rephrase that question. If you're not using organic-based natural dyes like we're going to talk about in a few minutes, if you haven't made that leap or transition, then if you're just choosing among them conventionally sold commercial textiles, would it be white?
Yes, it would be. Often the clothes will say undyed, or white is, cotton is primarily grown white and wool is grown white. And most hemp, rami, linen, they bleach it with hydrogen peroxide if it's an ecological process, or something a little stronger if it's not. But most textile grade fibers end up being white if they don't start that way. And that's probably the safest. The textile I'm wearing right now is just the color of the sheep. So
that's a woven sweater that you're wearing?
This is just a knit, like hand knit sweater.
Oh, hand knit sweater. Okay. And that's the natural color of the wool from the sheep.
No dye needed.
Excellent. I thought I was going to ask you about that because I'm sure you're very congruent in practicing what you're preaching. So you probably don't have any commercial dye clothing that you're wearing. So yeah, well, that's good. So it would seem to me that the most important clothing, I mean, if you're assuming there's a transfer for the skin, although maybe the majority of it is through the lint, as you mentioned, through the dryer, then it becomes another issue. But if it's truly a transfer of the skin, then your underwear would probably be some of the most significantly and most important clothing that you'd want to pay attention to. Would you agree with that?
From what I know of heat and water being so important in a chemical reaction, to accelerate things transferring and moving, that part of the body it's where it's just a lot goes on. It's hot, wet. It would, to me, it would be a place you would want an organic fiber.
Yeah, and naturally colored or uncolored fiber too, which is,
Yes,
which is the crux of this interview.
and I think that that's difficult to find.
Difficult is probably an understatement.
If you do search online, though, I have seen companies that do produce undyed organic cotton underwear. It is available. It's just not in plenty.
Yeah, one of the companies is our company, which will be available
Yay.
probably by the time this interview airs. We're hoping to have it by the end of 2017.
Wonderful.
Yeah, or GOTS. Is it GOTS? What is the
GOTS?
GOTS certified organic underwear, but we're going to certainly be sure that it's not dyed. So
Awesome.
now you had mentioned there's these other dyes, these vegetable-based materials that can be used, and I'm wondering if there's any movement to implement these strategies on a commercial basis, or it would seem that it might increase the cost, and there's maybe a reluctance to implement that on a widespread scale.
So when I first started this work, I could not find any plant-based dyed garments in the marketplace. So, 10 to 15, even 20 years ago, it was even going to festivals where you would see handmade items. It was very difficult to find makers who were focused on vegetable dyes. Today, though, it's actually really starting to change. Patagonia issued a naturally dyed tank top and men's shirt in the last 4 weeks. And they're beautiful, very subtle, nuanced color, because again, vegetable and plant-based pigment are not isolating the one pigment like the way a laboratory would isolate one pigment and amplify that one pigment in that canister of powder. That's really kind of one molecular structure. But in a plant or a vegetable, the pigment is actually a kind of a panoply of other colors. It's not just pink. There's purples and reds, and there's a whole spectrum of compounds that create pink. So that's why I find natural dyes very beautiful, and Patagonia did too. Eileen Fisher has issued a natural dye line of shirts I've seen recently for women in the last year. This is all very new. It's very exciting. Another brand, I'm not sure if the denim has been issued publicly. Excuse me. Sorry. But there is a woman in Tennessee growing a lot of indigo. Her name is Sarah Bellows, and she has a company called Stony Creek Color. And they are producing Japanese indigo, Persicaria tinctoria, at scale. And they're starting to actually use this blue pigment. They're fermenting and applying it to cottons for denim production at, I think, Cone Mills, which is one of our last large-scale denim weaving facilities in the country. And I've seen jeans issued that are from this plant-based blue from Tennessee. So I think it's getting there.
So what do you think is catalyzing this interest? Did you have anything to do with it? Did your book have a spark in the industry, or is it just a general awareness of the toxicity of these dyes?
Well, I did spend a good 10 years pounding the pavement in boardrooms and in the general public, doing a lot of public outreach. 4 to 5 workshops a month for most of my career was all about going out and teaching how to make your own natural dyes as a practice, as a cultural practice. And in tandem with that, I would say, making these dyes today, it's almost like making medicinal tea. It's very easy to do. So I want to contextualize the value of this work for you. And so what I would do is share this hour-long presentation on why making this tea is really of such great value to personal and global health. And I narrated it much more articulately than I'm even doing today, because I was very in the process end exercise of this spiel that I would give about this is how these dyes came on the scene in the Industrial Revolution. These are the waterways in China. Through tides and currents, we are getting exposed to pollution from other parts of the world. It's not just coming to us in the textiles, it's coming to us through water and air. And I do think there were so many industry leaders. I mean, even when I would teach a class at a botanic garden, there were industry leaders there. I would end up running into someone who was a materials designer for Target, or a couple of the women whose husbands were marketing at Patagonia were in my classes. And I think we're just, yeah, I mean, I am a piece of a movement. But I do think that it just has been rippling out for a little over a decade. And this movement began, though, really in the 60s and 70s. Natural dye traditions and textiles saw a resurgence, in that era of counterculture. A lot of these things, Rachel Carson's work for organic food, there was an organic textile movement. It hit again in the early 90s, but it was very commercially focused, not craft focused. So I think what we're doing now is we're synthesizing the work of the commercial movement in the 90s, pre-NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, organic American textile movement. We're synthesizing that with the craft movement of the 60s and 70s. And I think you're getting this industrial craft bridge now. And you're starting to see people bring artisanship into the bigger industry. And how to do that is this ongoing conversation. But there's many of us out there. I mean, I wrote a natural dye book in 2009, and then you saw, a lot of my friends have written books since. It's beautiful. I'm in the Northern California region, there's 4 or 5 of us who are, pretty diligently focused on this work.
So I'm particularly curious as to why you're motivated to pursue this as a professional career. I understand your initial exposure teaching kids, 9-year-olds, how to naturally color their clothes with less toxic materials. But what catalyzed you to follow this professionally? Because I think most people probably would just shrug that off and go on to other things. But there's clearly something that sparked an interest in you for this.
It's a very good question. And it's hard to chalk it up in word, because it's actually, it's a very hard to put your finger on 1 or 2 sets of reasons that I could say have attracted me into the work. But to be so simple about it, it's beauty, it's a land-based connection, it's natural dyes bring you, like any farming movement. So if you really take to cooking and producing food as medicine, you start to realize that food as medicine brings you often to the soil and the soil health. And you start to realize how nutrient dense is my food? Oh, what are the microbes in my soil? How does that relate to my colon and the pharmacological realities of, the health of my microbiome? People who go really deep into, I think, land-based survival. I mean, food, clothing, and shelter, that's it for humans. It's their most fundamental level. And so I'm using food as an example because I think more people have gone down the rabbit hole of food as medicine. But textiles as medicine is part of an Ayurvedic tradition that goes back longer than maybe we even know, but people say 5,000 years, where wearing turmeric dyed clothes was prescribed to those who had rheumatoid arthritis.
Was not aware of that.
What was that?
I was not aware of that.
It's been recently reinvigorated in India as modern, salient, peer-reviewed practice. It's something that has held its tradition. And Ayurvedic tradition would prescribe indigo wearing those who had rigid thinking or an inability to perceive a more nuanced or dynamic future for themselves would be prescribed indigo. Has that stayed has that held through double blind or whatever peer-reviewed research? I don't know. But what I mean is that there is a whole experience of textiles and connecting to land that you can get involved in as you get into natural dyes, you get into gardening, you get into soil health, you get into personal health. It's another avenue for connecting to these bigger cycles. And so it's bigger than any one human, and that's what makes it, I think, such a deep practice and something that you can dedicate your life to.
So thank you for expanding on that answer. I think that helps us understand your perspective a bit better. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the soil connection, on the use of these commercial toxic dyes versus the natural ones, which clearly are non-toxic and are only going to enhance the soil microbiome, and if grown in a natural way, of course, not contribute to any decimation of the topsoil or the soil microbiome.
So if you're growing a certified organic crop of indigo, one of the things that I've been doing is focusing on not only certified organic and biodynamic, which means I'm using as many inputs as I can from the farm itself. I'm not importing inputs. I'm focused on cycling nutrients on one land base. That's pretty much the very general sketch of biodynamic. So to add to that around soil health and natural dyes, one of my focal points is also about no-till agriculture. So really protecting the microbiome of the soil. It was described to me by David Montgomery, who wrote The Hidden Half of Nature, in a workshop a couple weeks ago, that when we till the soil, it's kind of like, he described it as someone taking the roof of our conference that we were sitting in, take the roof off and stirring the insides of the conference room. And all the people and the chairs and everything ends up turned upside down, and there's a lot of death and destruction. And he likened that to using a plow in the soil. Mm-hmm. And the air pockets in the soil are so important for the health of microbes. And and water holding capacity is also created by these oxygen pockets. And so when we compact soil, when we turn it up and then compact it, when we step on it or when we put a heavy tractor across it, we're creating the conditions for less life. And less diverse life in the soil means that the plants are not getting access to the same micronutrients, because the fungal networks under the soil are, the plant is giving them through root exudates access to carbohydrates, and these fungal networks are eating the root exudates from the plant, taking that as fodder and fuel, and going out and getting remote little micro pockets of nutrients that might exist miles and miles away from the tree or the plant, and bringing these trace minerals back to the plant. And this is what happens in a system that's not using nitrogen fertilizers, which is like fast food for a plant. But when you're really allowing these air pockets and microbes and fungal networks to all really coexist, you're allowing plants to hold really all these micronutrients and phytonutrients, I suppose you might call them, that you don't necessarily get in a system that is tilling soil using synthetic compounds. And I would say with the natural dyes, I get much stronger dye color from fewer plants if the soil is in this good health, which is porous soil and dynamic, has a lot of microfauna. So the same ethics that we're using for food production are around soil health are the same ethics I'm applying to my textile farming. And I don't see textile farming as really much different from food farming, and even on the land.
Sure, it shouldn't be.
They should all be integrated.
So how big is your farm?
Well, it's just under an acre.
Okay.
I just moved to a 2-acre site, but it's micro. The work that I do, though, primarily with my organization, is help farmers who are on much larger landscapes. Right. What was that?
To teach people how to do it rather than supplying the material yourself.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I would assume also that you're not monocropping in that, and that you have a wide diversity of plants to encourage diversity in the soil.
Oh, for sure. This is a food fiber textile dye integrative system. And pollinator habitat becomes part of that. Hedgerows where you're planting species of plants that harbor beneficial insects. Yeah, I mean, polyculture is just, it's creating so much more productivity and so many different things you can use, medicine, food, dye. I think polycultures are the only way to go for the future.
It occurred to me too, when you're talking about the synthetic dyes and how they were only focused on one wavelength, essentially, one specific frequency, that it, in some ways, was very similar to monocropping. And that when you had the natural pigments, you had a wider variety of wavelengths that was probably healthier from a different perspective than the lack of phthalates or metabolites or that would cause endocrine disruption. So there may be providing this balanced set of frequencies, which is beneficial to your body, not only when you look at it, but probably when the sun shines on it and passes those frequencies through the clothing into your skin.
Very interesting way to think about it. I think about the frequency too in terms of our eye health. Mm-hmm. And just having, I think the Inuit were the ones that I learned were able to see the color. Well, it's not a color. They were able to see white as like 35 different shades. And it would help them really do whatever they need to do for hunting and survival, to see how the ice really came across in all these different shades of white and nuances of white. And I think about our way of seeing colors being so oversimplified, and what is that doing to the cones of our eyes? Are we kind of devolving our abilities to perceive the natural world because we're oversimplifying the visual landscape? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting strategy, and it's a perspective that I believe most of us don't give much thought to, because we've got so many other issues to be concerned about. But I'm glad people like you are out there are figuring these items out to keep us healthier. So it's greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Now, you're the director of Fibershed, which is a word you coined, and perhaps you can explain why you came up with that and what it means, and what do you think the future of this path or approach might be in the next 10 years? Or what's your hope, at least, for it?
Well, I'll start with just what a Fibershed is. It's a strategic geography that allows one to garner, produce, farm, ranch, harvest what you need for a textile resource base. So a Fibershed is like a food shed. A Fibershed is like a watershed. Again, it's just about what is that strategic geography that clothes you. And it's actually a question or a threshold that you would walk through to kind of exercise the notion, wow, land is responsible for clothing me. That's one reason I created the term and the organization, because at this point, around 70% of the fiber that's in our wardrobes is synthetic, and it's fossil carbon derived. So we actually have, from a mainstream culture standpoint, we have a big public education job on our hands to get people to understand that as we divest from fossil carbon, as we move towards the keep it in the ground 350.org or whatever strategies that we need to rebalance our carbon cycle, we have to divest not only from fossil carbon energy systems that are fueling our residential and commercial economy, we have to divest from these modern forms of color. And we actually have to divest from these modern performance fibers that are made from fossil carbon. They're made from coal tar. And we no longer have the capacity to burn fossil carbon. There's just a saturation point from our ocean health and the acidification to 407 ppm of CO2 in our atmosphere. We've burned ancient sunlight, and it's, we have to transition. So the organization Fibershed is, yes, it's this intimate idea of what is this strategic geography. It's a very ancient concept, but the idea is to get people to start waking up to land-based fibers. And how do we make that transition to these land-based fibers and not rely on genetic engineering or synthetic biology, which are big topics I don't know if we have time for, but I'm really trying to get to focus people on conservation breeds, resilient heirloom genetics, open pollinated sources of material, and focus our land-based systems on strengthening our place-based economies, which to me is a strategy for climate change amelioration, de-acidifying the oceans, healing some of the political divide around urban and rural communities. Because when you develop a fiber shed, you start to need your farming community and your fashion community to work together. Ranchers and high-end designers partnering, there's a lot of cultural healing that occurs, and a lot of, oh, you're not so bad.
So have you actually seen that, or can you?
Oh yeah.
And can you give us some examples, because that's a bit of a hard concept to digest.
Well, I have worked with many ranchers and farmers who, even in California, don't have a lot of trust for what they would call big government, and they have reasons for that. They also, you know, they don't gravitate towards identity politics. You know, I'm not just going to judge this, I'm just going to describe the landscape we're on. They don't identify with what they call entitlement programs. They really do have a view of free market capitalism. That's the storyline about how things work and how things need to work. So when I go to urban communities, you know, the opposite side of that coin is I will be in a design school with young people who are telling me we need to wear polyester because we can't shear sheep, and sheep get injured during the shearing process. And I've seen horrible PETA films, and I just don't, how can we wear wool? And very ideologically driven ideas about what rural life is like, but never having experienced rural life. So we have a very big bridge to build. So what I've been doing is I've been taking designers, and this is how this Fibershed concept started, was a 1-year wardrobe challenge where I would take design school students to farms and ranches. And the farmer and the rancher and the designer would actually work together to produce one garment from that farm or ranch. And then I wore that garment for 1 year. I had it professionally photographed and videoed so people could see what these urban and rural collaborations were really about. And people became very friendly with each other because they had to collaborate in the making process as a team. And they were paid. I ran a Kickstarter campaign to raise enough money to help everyone do these R&D projects. And since then, we've seen businesses start. I've had ranchers come to boardrooms for urban brands that are deciding on what their climate strategy is. A rancher who wasn't so keen on talking about climate change coming to a boardroom with materials designers at a major brand, a transnational corporation, and the rancher saying, ranching and farming is a heroic process. We can be part of your climate change solution. We are land-based economies. We can sequester carbon. We grow material that we think is going to be of great value to your supply chain. And they're willing to get on the table and just talk openly about climate change from a rancher's perspective. And they're driving to urban communities talking about this because really what they want is an economic tie. How to get that wool in that supply chain, how to get that organic cotton in the supply chain. And so what it does is it just opens the doors of perception around, you know, it gets you out of your head about who you think people are, and it just gives you time to be with people. Well, and it's pretty powerful, actually. I've seen a lot of transformation.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a great strategy, and kudos to you for implementing it and catalyzing this social healing that's been occurring between these different communities. Now, just for clarification, when you mention ranchers, I'm assuming these are sheep ranchers, because when we hear ranchers, we typically think of horses. Oh, yeah. Well, actually, a lot of the ranching community I work with focuses on, they could focus on goats, sheep, alpaca, Okay.
Cows, horses. I mean, it's anything with a hoof.
Really? So you can take hair from a cow and convert it into textiles?
Well, cows are just often a part of the ranching family. Like when
Okay.
a large ranch is.
Sure. So that, so that you need them all to actually improve the quality of the soil. It's
Mhm.
holistic herd management, and they integrate their large volume of nitrogen supply into the soil and graze the pasture, and actually can create pretty massive amounts of topsoil if implemented properly. Now, Alan Savory's done quite a bit of work on that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
so
understand that. Exactly.
yeah, I get it. Yeah, I've was at the first holistic herd management conference in Boulder, Colorado a few years ago with Alan Savory.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
That's the heartbeat of making this all work is.
yeah. So it was a bit confused because it was, this is only one aspect of a commercial ranching operation, would be the goats, which is just the goats and sheep and alpacas. Not many ranchers have alpacas, but they certainly could. And they can direct that as a commodity to basically increase the revenue stream on their ranching operation.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's exciting. So what do you perceive the greatest avenue for increase to be? The actual distribution or use of these natural materials undyed, or the actual expansion of the organically, vegetably based dyes into the commercial textile industry?
Well, the expansion, we've just started to see the emergence. We've done a report to see, if we were to supplant the current use of blue with plant-based blue, moving from synthetic to biosphere, we would need something like 56 million hectares of indigo. So
that's a lot of indigo.
So that really points to these vegetable-based dyes are to be treated differently. Our consumption practices around color, we have to have a cultural conversation about how we're consuming color, in my opinion.
Can we base that conversation on what previous cultures have done? Because these synthetic dyes have only been available for a relatively short time, and yet we've had colored clothing for millennia.
Exactly. And so what it comes down to, yes, I think that's going back to the ancients, the pre-fossil carbon textile programs. In Europe, people were wearing nettle, flax, and sheep's wool. In North Africa, they were wearing cotton. In South America, they were wearing cotton. In India and China, they were wearing cotton and hemp. Europe had hemp as well. But those materials were undyed. And so you would just wear the color of the raw fiber. And the sheep's wool in particular comes in such an amazing scheme of color, from black all the way through the tones of gray, shades of gray, brown, all the shades of brown, cream colors, and of course white. But you don't need to really dye the wool of a sheep, and you can use that and blend it with nettle or flax or hemp, and you can create really dynamic heathering processes by how you spin the fibers together. So my solution, I think, you're already speaking to it, is just actually use the color of the material as it comes off the plant and not really have to add too much more color to that. And then the last thing I'll say about the vegetable matter and how we can increase access to natural dyes might be using materials that are on their way to being composted. So avocado pits, water
what color does an avocado pit make?
Pink.
Really? Who would have known? I had no idea.
I know.
I go through 1 or 2 avocados a day, sometimes 3, and that's a lot, so that adds up pretty quickly. I had no idea you could make a dye out of that.
It's beautiful. There's a book called Natural Dyes by Sasha Duer. She's an artist I work with. She's in Oakland. And her book that just came out has some really nice processes around avocado pit dye. And if you look up Sasha Duerr, she really
How do you spell that?
Duerr, Duerr.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, she has some beautiful imagery on all of her social media profiles of her avocado pit dye. It's been a recipe since the 70s and 80s, as far as I can tell.
So you just grind it up, the pits, and then somehow mix it with a solvent?
I just quarter the pit and I put it in a pot of water, and I put a little alkaline, like baking soda or oyster shells, something to alkalize.
Yeah, baking soda is the simplest one.
Yeah, and baking soda. And so then I just heat it up to about 180 degrees for half an hour, 45 minutes. And that's pre-boiling. And that pretty much will yield the pink. It'll start coming out of the avocado.
Fascinating. It's giving me some good ideas, because we're going to be making these, or have a whole line of organic clothing coming this fall. So we'll have to clearly make some really interesting prescriptions for or directions on how to make pink clothing from avocado pits. That is just extraordinary.
It's a beautiful process. And onion skins is another compostable. They could use that. So if you wanted, before you issue your line, or during the process, I can give you a list of resources that people
that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be really good. Yeah, we'll have to get that together. And timing's really good, because this interview should air about the time that our clothing line is released. So
perfect.
I'm really excited about this. It's Care What You Wear is the name of the campaign. So
Regeneration International?
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Actually, the profits from the sale of the clothing is going to support Regeneration International.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So yeah, we try to walk our talk.
Thank you.
When we're teaching this. So
good. Well, the one thing I don't think I answered your question about the vision for our future with this.
Yeah. No, you didn't. But you had so much other good information in there. It didn't almost matter, but that was good. So what is the vision for 10 years from now?
The vision for 10 years is something I share with Regeneration International and others who are focused on ameliorating the climate crisis through building soil organic carbon, which is a lot of us out there now, that these Fibershed systems we think about them like food sheds and watersheds. We organize around soil and water availability. We don't engineer nature to do its bidding. We work in harmony with these processes that are in existence. We enhance water holding capacity in dry, brittle systems so that we can produce what we need, even in areas where there's 10 inches or less of rainfall per year. And these are systems that, if we enhance their productivity through natural mechanisms, I think that we will, again, these natural productive states create local economies. When you have something you can grow, you have something you can eat, you can have something you can wear, then you have something you can trade. So if we can restore Earth's soils, restore these waters, I think one of the lenses for doing that work is actually approaching it like we want to create more jobs in rural communities. We want these people to feel taken care of and nurtured, and we want to be buying things from them and supporting their good work on the land. And so I think our work in 10 years is to really see these cultural, political bridges built through trading, through exchanging, but all on the foundation of these restored soils. And through these regenerated social biocultural economies, we then trade with each other from strength and not from the lowest common denominator imperial attitude, which is, I'm going to use this community to produce clothing for me for 10 years until they decide to create a labor union, and then I'm going to throw them over my shoulder like a chicken bone, and then I'm off to Cambodia, and then I'm in Vietnam, and then I'm in the Indonesian archipelago. That's been the textile industry. It just keeps running to the lowest common denominator and leaving a wake of destruction in its path. And so we're trying to reverse that trend of imperial exploitation by focusing, even white people, on how to work and how to be part of a community that works and labors in a meaningful way on the land and with each other. And of course, some of us aren't going to work on the land, but we can consume things from the land with an educated mind and a thoughtful way of approaching consumerism.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think you've nailed a lot of good points right on the head. And one of them being is that we have to change the consciousness around the fashion industry. I mean, it's just, we've aired a few documentaries on this, and certainly the new interest in minimalism now, and how rapidly people go through clothing is just it's non-sustainable, first of all, and it's just ruining everything. I mean, there's no reason to dispose of clothes like people are doing and change fashions all the time, but there's this whole pretty aggressive industry built around it. It supports it. So hopefully, you know, your type of your work and others will help to shift that consciousness around it, because it's desperately needed. And I really am enamored with your concept of creating these local communities, because one of the facts that we didn't mention, but it's sort of the elephant in the room, is that the advent of artificial intelligence and robots is rapidly increasing. And in about 10 years or so, there's going to be a lot of jobs that are lost. And I don't really perceive, certainly not this century, that technology will ever be able to replace what you just discussed. It's just not possible. I mean, maybe next century, you know, who knows? I mean, it's so hard to think about anything beyond 10 or 20 years, but because technology develops so quickly. But it really is, you described a great model that people can shift to as technology starts taking away their jobs.
Yes. As far as I know, the cost benefit of creating an AI system or a robotic system for making natural dyes in your backyard, there's no cost benefit for venture capitalists to automate.
No competition. Yeah, it's hard to, it just couldn't do it. It's even difficult to imagine how it would. I'm sure at some point they will be able to do it, but I don't think it's this century. So it's generations beyond us.
Yes. And we need to just also think about where we're at, like in our frontal lobe and our human evolution. I'm kind of like, if you just put everyone out of work this fast, you know, you're going to have some serious issues with like our democracy, our civil society. I mean, there's a domino effect that I think.
No question. Most people aren't even thinking about it. I mean,
they're just saying, oh, isn't it so great? We can patent and, you know, keep centralizing capital in these, you know, another patentable space for capital to accrue more capital. That's about all I can see their motivation being. Oh, and they say things like humans, I've heard technologists say, humans should just be doing beautiful things like yoga and art. Well, I agree that that's a very nice vision, but I don't think that's why you're doing this. You know, like, I think it smells funny to me when I hear things like that.
Listen, who knows? Anything's possible, but it certainly hasn't been consistent with the history of humankind, where we really need to endeavor in areas where we're providing value to our fellow human beings. So I greatly appreciate, and it's really been an enlightening conversation. Certainly areas that we don't normally explore, and I applaud your efforts in this area and your commitment to making changes. And you've written a best-selling book called Harvesting Color, which is available, I'm assuming, online at Amazon or any other bookstore that you would choose to use. So it's definitely one to look at if you have an interest in this area. But could you recommend any other resources?
I would recommend the books by Christine Vehar, A Modern Natural Dyer, and Sasha Duer's book, Natural Dyes. And the November 11th event, it's an annual wool and fine fiber symposium. The reason why we call it that is because we really want this to be a land-based symposia that focuses on meeting and greeting the people in our community that grow raw materials, fiber and dye. But this year's event is focused on nature's resilience, illuminating the processes and cycles that clothe us. And we're bringing in oceanographers and biogeochemists to talk about the health of the whole global carbon and hydrologic systems and contextualizing the ranching and farming work in these larger picture scenarios. So I think it's a great event on November 11th, the Wool Symposium in Point Reyes Station, which is...
And how do people find out about it? Is there a
you
website?
can go to Fibershed, www.fibershed.org.
Okay, .org, not .com. Fibershed, just like it sounds, fibershed.org.
Fibershed.org, yeah.
Wow, that's great.
So that would be the way to come and meet everyone in person, and some Fibershed community organizers from the Pacific Northwest will be there, and different areas of the country, Montana. People come in from other communities that are trying to do this work. So it's a great time to meet an audience that's focused on.
Well, hopefully we'll have some of our viewers who take us up on your offer or take you up on your offer and come out and visit. It sounds like a very worthwhile event.
Thank you. I hope to see people there.
Oh, great. So any other resources or summaries that you'd like to make?
I think people can just go to our website. We are at fibershed.org, and there's all of our textile research, economic feasibility studies on regenerative agriculture and how to tie the monetary and carbon cycles together. All the work we've done on land-based economic development, a lot of the studies and analysis are on our website. So if people want to dig deeper in how to make this work, we've done a lot of work to explore how to do it. And we've put some businesses on the ground already. And there's a whole list. There's 140 different independent artists and farmers who you can read about who are doing this work.
Okay, well, thank you for your work and for your passion in this and really helping educate the world and your local communities, and the really compelling vision of how you can bring healing to the world through some simple strategies. So thank you.
Avocado pits.
Avocado pits all the way. All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.